Welcome to Peak Mind. I'm your host, Michael Trainer, and I'm here with Levison Wood at the Hotel Panamera in lovely Tulum, Mexico.
What a place to be.
It's not bad, hey? So I actually found out about you, it must have been when I was here about a year ago, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Dear friend of mine, fellow Brit, actually was pointed out when you, I think it was when you had just launched or about to launch Art of Exploration, your most recent book. And I did a little deep dive and had seen you walk the Nile, walk the Himalayas.
Yeah.
And I was like, in this age of everything moving, more quickly, more technologically, I've always had a bit of a romanticism for the sort of the age of exploration, if you will, and one of my, I don't know if you ever watched this film, Mountains on the Moon, but it was one of my favorite films. And so when I saw the Nile, I was like, I got to talk to this guy. So anyway, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Likewise, thank you. It sounds like we've got a lot in common.
Yeah, exactly. So if you could start by giving a little bit of background. I know you have a military background.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear kind of, at least in the States, and I don't want to be, so my grandfather and my father both served, but a lot of times, at least in the States, I find people, especially because oftentimes service correlates with a sense of sort of patriotism, and at least in previous generations, it often led to people sort of being more at home. Like once they got home, they were like, okay, now I'm so elated to be home. I'm sticking around, planting the flag and building a home. You have taken what seems to me to be a somewhat different course. So, how did your time, sort of your military experience, inform or influence your decision to become sort of a man about the world?
A man about the world. Well, you know what? I think even before I joined the military, travel was my first love.
Yeah.
I was inspired from a very young age, a bit like yourself, reading the stories of the great age of exploration. I grew up reading all about Lawrence of Arabia, and Shackleton, and the polar explorers of the early 20th century. And so that was my inspiration, Livingston off in the middle of Africa. And then I think my father was a teacher, so he really encouraged me to learn about history, and that really was my passion. My grandfather, he served in the Second World War in the Far East, in Burma, so I grew up with his stories. And he came from a very humble background, and so for him to go off to places like India and Japan, and he was passing on his astonishment with the big wide world. And so when I grew up, it was always going to be something that I knew I had to do. As soon as I was old enough to leave home, I knew I wanted to travel, and that's what I did. I did what a lot of young people do these days and go away on a gap year traveling before university, and that really cemented in my own mind a desire to really see as much of the world as possible. So I studied history at university, and I specialised in the history of travel writing, so it kind of all neatly came together then, and just did more and more adventurous journeys, really. So before I joined the army, I decided I was going to hitchhike the length of the Silk Road. So I hitchhiked from where I studied in Nottingham in the middle of England all the way to India, and travelled through places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, the North Caucasus. And this was in 2004 when things were pretty spicy down there.
Spicy is a good word. Yeah.
So even before I joined the military, my mind was really set on a life of travel, and what that meant was by the time I did join the army in 2005, I went to the military academy at Sandhurst, and ended up joining the British Parachute Regiment. It was strange because a lot of my soldiers were sort of either looking forward or concerned by the fact they were going to serve in Afghanistan, and I'd already spent a few months there traveling and actually meeting the locals. So I went with a slightly different perspective on it. The military, I look back on very fondly. I had a great time in many respects. I made lots of very good friends, and I think for my job now, it gave me a global network of people that I could call upon to find out more about a particular region and do my job now. And for the last sort of decade, being a professional explorer, traveler, whatever you want to call it, I think being able to call people, whether that's friends who've gone to work for the United Nations or NGOs or in the security world, all around the world, has helped me enormously. And I probably wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing now were it not for that experience.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So basically, the network is actually one of the greatest things you took away from that experience.
Yeah.
That makes a ton of sense, actually. So, if you went from basically this hitchhiking experience through Afghanistan to then a military deployment in Afghanistan, how did the juxtapositions? Because I think that's something fascinating to me. Because I feel like oftentimes people come in and obviously they've for better or worse, enter within a particular worldview, especially in a combat situation, where there's a notion. There's a book, I don't know if you've ever read it, actually. It was by a U.S. Navy SEAL, but he actually came from an experience which was quite fascinating of NGO background.
Okay.
And he went from an NGO background to then doing SEAL training and then re-entering some of the places he had visited as a SEAL. And he just talked about his consciousness being oriented more from being one of service, it's kind of like a heart and a fist, to one of actually seeing basically, like entering into a context where you're seeing everything as a potential threat.
Yes.
Now, this is a black and white dichotomy, and I'm sure it's way more nuanced, but how did having had a pre-existing experience with the people, which oftentimes obviously gives you more of a human perspective, influence your perspective, and how did that sort of play out in your own mind?
So, no, you're absolutely right, because when I'd hitchhiked through Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan as essentially a student backpacker, I was treated with nothing but kindness, respect. I was looked after. I remember being in Afghanistan 2004. It was Ramadan. I was just taken to people's homes and looked after amazingly well, shown incredible hospitality. So I came away with this really positive viewpoint. So to then go and sort of be sent there in uniform and get shot at was a very different experience. But I think the positivity stayed with me, actually, because I don't think I was too indoctrinated by that military way of thinking, which does tend to necessarily force you to see everything through that lens of danger and actually I think that's, for me at least, was a positive thing, because when I left I wasn't too jaded by the world. I was still positive, and I wanted to reconnect with that sort of spirit of positivity, and that's kind of what I've been doing since leaving the military, is trying to really show people what places that tend to have a bad reputation are really like, rather than what we see on the news day in, day out, particularly in the Middle East or Central Asia, where it's inevitably war, terrorism, destruction, and so that my focus really since then has been trying to sort of break some of those stereotypes and showcase to people the more positive side.
Yeah, I think it's beautifully said, and I feel like so essential, because we've gotten such a limited bandwidth, I think, of exposure to that culture. And one of the fascinating things that I've loved in my own experience of traveling through sort of the Middle East was that incredible notion of hospitality.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if I've ever had an experience of hospitality quite like I experienced there. And so it's such a dichotomy to see all these images of war, and obviously then have such a heart open. And interestingly enough, just to sort of keep it in that military tone, and I'm sure you know the story of this sort of the 12 SEALs that went down, and then one being taken in by a village, and the village actually even though they weren't particularly loyal to the U.S., but defending that because he was a guest in their home against the Taliban, to their own potential mortal risk. And I was like, wow, that level of hospitality is so profound, and yet we so rarely get these kinds of stories. We
rarely see or hear about this, and that, what you're talking about there, is you find it all across the region. The Pashtunwali is what they call it in southern Afghanistan. It's this code that you must look after a stranger, even if he's your enemy. If he comes to you asking for help, you are duty bound to look after them, and it's amazing to sort of be on the receiving end of that, and I feel very lucky to have seen it with my own eyes. I ended up staying with Mujahideen fighters, opium smugglers, and all the sort of bad guys that we hear about, and actually, of course, on a one-to-one level, everyone was perfectly friendly and very nice.
What were some of the greater? Do you have any great stories, actually? I guess I'm sure you have epic stories across the whole. But when you mentioned sort of opium smugglers and Mujahideen, what would be something that maybe you can share an anecdote or some insight that you garnered from that experience, or maybe a story? I would love. I'm fascinated by it.
So many. Particularly in Afghanistan, I look back to that first trip. You know, I think my mum and dad thought I was on holiday in Greece at the time. I didn't tell them I was hitchhiking across Afghanistan. But I remember I sort of left Herat. I crossed over from Iran, and at this stage, I should add here that I had literally no money, right? So I'd left university. I think I had £500. So what's that? $750 in my bank account, and my intention was to just see how far I could get with that.
Yeah. With
India in mind, and I got to Iran with a traveller's check. Remember those?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Back in the day,
totally.
And it was like $100 travel. That was my final one. But you get to Iran and then realise there's no cash machines for any foreign cards, and you can't cash dollars traveller's checks in Iran because it was all sanctioned in those days.
Yeah.
So I entered Iran with no money, so I was just living on handouts and like literally hitchhiking, being taken in by families, and I was getting more and more terrified because the further east I got, I was getting to the Afghanistan border, and I knew with no money, and that was a pretty terrifying prospect. So, but I thought I'm just going to try and blend in. So I managed to sort of get given some like second-hand Pashtun clothes, so I blended. I'd got a pretty good beard by then as well, and so there I was hitchhiking through the mountains. I got picked up in this by this those trucks that you get, like supposed to be for 8 people, but they cram in 16 people and all their pets. Off we went over the mountains, and just as we were going over the mountains, the brakes failed, and we're flying down this cliff. And the driver, to his credit, didn't jump out of the car. Everyone else was trying to jump out of the windows. I was stuck right at the back because I had the worst seat. And anyway, the bus, just as it was going around the corner, it was going to go off the edge of a cliff, somehow smashed into a lorry, which stopped the truck going off the cliff. Sadly, the driver was completely crushed, poor guy, and he was taken away to a hospital. We all survived, but like the truck driver, who'd essentially saved our lives by being parked on the edge of the cliff, was like, okay, I'll look after you. So he then drove us to the next village, put on a great feast, and it was this most surreal experience because he said, oh, we need to watch some TV to cheer you up. And the only VHS they had was Rambo 3, the one in Afghanistan. And all of these guys, who were all former Mujahideen fighters themselves, were cheering on as Rambo was fighting the Soviets. And I was sat there having literally just almost lost my life in a car accident, surrounded by Mujahideen fighters watching Rambo in the middle of Afghanistan. And I'll never forget that. It was just the most bizarre experience.
That's incredible.
But somehow managed to make it all the way through, and with zero money.
Wow. So literally with $750, you went from London all the way
to
basically
Goa,
to Goa, India.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah. All off the grace, a couple of dollars in the grace of good humans.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
So this is incredible. So, okay, formative experience. I had a somewhat analogous experience where I actually lived, I didn't share this with you earlier, but I wound up living in Sri Lanka for 2 years.
Amazing.
So it totally changed my life. I actually wound up getting invited to study with a traditional healer in a culture where there was no word for privacy and there's no word for possession.
Yeah.
So when one person fell out, it was a particular form of Ayurvedic basically lineage medicine, but the occult practices. So if one person fell out of balance, it was the role of the entire community to bring them back because they were seen as inseparable. So they would create these elaborate palm fraud structures, making offerings to the deities, the pre-Buddhistic deities, and put this person right in the middle, and from sunset to sunrise, they would literally ritually recreate their shared cosmological worldview.
Wow.
All with the intention of that person feeling seen and loved enough to come back into balance.
Yeah.
And it was such a formative experience for me, myself. I was 19 years old, that it radically changed the direction of my life. Because you grow up with this certain individual-centered worldview, and then I was like, okay, this is a totally different perspective. From there, it sounds like there's obviously a multitude of adventures you've gone on. How many books are you on now?
I've written 10. I've got another 2 coming out next year, hopefully. So,
my God. So I'm tomorrow, my agent is, and I'm slightly embarrassed to admit, especially with someone as prolific as yourself, but it's taken me 2.5 years to write. I've written 500 pages, distilled it down to 80 pages, 80 page proposal, which I'm finally happy with.
Amazing.
But I'd love to hear sort of, as someone who is holding the tradition of travel writing, I think in such a high way, and continues to utilize it to fuel, I think, a lifestyle that many people would yearn for. I think especially in this day and age, and particularly in this moment. What have been some of the ways in which, if you will, the writing experiences inform the way that you go about traveling? Because at least from an observer's point of view, I love that you're taking sort of my projection, the slow road. Like you're walking, you walk the Nile. You walk in the Himalayas. And writing also, from my experience, I've had a long walk just to even get through the proposal. Like it's been in the age of Twitter, to sort of bring it a little bit back. What I loved about rituals in Sri Lanka was it was a different notion of time.
Yes.
Time was reified anew in a way that was aligned to the stars.
Yeah.
And we've become so aligned to tweets and so fast moving and so away from the circadian rhythm that and perhaps I'm romanticizing it. Someone who I think spends their time writing books and walking on long expeditions is staying with the let's call it a more traditional notion of time, at least in my own view. But I'd love to hear how writing plays into the way that you perceive travel.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. The circadian rhythm of just being on this journey and really reconnecting with what human beings are all about is what has been the perhaps inadvertent effect of what I've been doing. I don't think I necessarily set out to go on really long walks. I think that was perhaps a sort of legacy of some of my military experiences. Was some of the best journeys that I'd done hadn't been anything that was too contrived or sort of overly thought through. It was just an A to B journey on foot, and that's part of the sort of the warrior's code in the military, and it's something that I wanted to take with me when I left the military. Was I was a guide. I was an expedition guide, leading walking journeys in essentially post-conflict zones. We did trekking in Afghanistan, hiking over the mountains in Iraq and Iran, and taking people to places that were off limits. So the idea of doing a really long walking journey along the Nile came because I wanted to write a book. I wanted to sort of hopefully contribute to some of the legacy of the explorers of yesterday that we talked about, and I knew that to do that I had to do a journey that was worth writing about. And the Nile had always fascinated me since I was a kid. Like I said, I read all about, Richard Burton was my favourite of all the Victorian explorers, but people like Samuel Baker and Livingstone and all the other those very hairy, mustachioed men from the 19th century. But that river in particular, it has always been the lifeblood of Africa. And I sort of did a bit of research as anyone walked it, and I was quite surprised when I figured that because of the various wars and conflicts and border closures that had essentially been in place until the middle of the 20th century, nobody had done it. And when you ask why hasn't a local done it, it's like, well, why would they, frankly? So I thought, well, here's a challenge that I'd like to do on foot, to really I had no interest in necessarily breaking records or anything like that. It was really about, like you said, connecting with the most authentic human experience, which is what the cavemen did, which was go off on a really long walk and see what that feels like and see if it's possible. And in doing so, document a moment in time, because if you were to do that journey now, or somebody did that 100 years ago, very different experiences. But I think the process of putting one foot in front of the other, there's something very authentic about that, and I think that is something that hopefully the audience, the reader, can connect with, because most people can walk, and most people do walk on if not a daily basis, at least a little bit. And there's something accessible about that, and people can relate to it and say, well, maybe I could do that one day. And so that's what I tried to write about, is that universal experience. And the stories that fall out of it, the adventures, are all really less consequential than the process of connecting with yourself, essentially, on that journey. And for me, that was the start of many long walks. That was it blows my mind now. That was 8 years ago, and every year since then I've tried to do a big journey on foot since then. So I found it really has been helpful, useful for me to just do something that I believe in and share that with others. It's been a real privilege.
I like that. I like what you said about accessibility, because I feel like I resonate with that. Anyone can walk, you know, and I think something that was evoked as you were sharing was this notion, actually, as well, of as I was thinking about Sri Lanka and then listening to you talk about, you know, now this is almost like a rite of, not in my own words, but rite of passage that you're taking year in, year out, to find a place to take a long walk. And I thought about the walkabout in the Aboriginal tradition.
Yeah.
And I was very, very honored and lucky to actually be invited on Men's Business by an Aboriginal elder. And I thought about that, you know, when he took me out, you know, I mean, it was wild. You know, basically it was the namesake Uluru, right? Uluru being the most sacred place for the Aboriginals. And he's like, tomorrow we're taking you on Men's Business. And I was like, I had no idea what this meant, you know, but I was like, all right. It pulls up, dusty, you know, we're in the middle, red sand everywhere. Get in the back, there's a barrel of a gun, not even a full gun, but just the barrel and a trigger, and 2 kangaroo tails. And I was like, all right, I have no idea what Men's Business is, but this is definitely going to be an adventure. So I get in the back, and the only way I knew we were on it, we were really up for, was we started barreling, must have been going 70 or 80 kilometers an hour. It said Aboriginal only, land. We're cruising on a red dirt track, and the guy stops abruptly, you know, huge red cloud of sand. And he pulls me out of the car, and he picks up, you know, we're talking a total red sand bush landscape, right? Like just like dusty weeds. And he saw, you know, you probably know these thorny devils, right? These little toads, super cool. Like they look like little mini aliens, you know. Yeah. But like I could barely see it, like with it pointed out right in front of me. And this guy somehow saw it at 80K, you know, like amazing, shooting down a track. And when he shared stories that night by the campfire, it was my first experience of someone not recounting something that happened, but at least in the way that I experienced it, speaking something into reality, like speaking something into existence. And the way that he shared story and this idea of a walkabout, and this, which I wouldn't be able to do, obviously I don't have that knowledge, but the fact that they could go out walking for up to a year's time with nothing on them, right, in the middle of a harsh desert, shows that I think also the attunement that can come from
100%.
The walkabout process. How do you find it, you sort of attune differently when you're in the midst of your walk?
I think good examples from my last sort of big walk, which was I walked across Botswana and wrote a book about that called The Last Giants, and it really was to follow the biggest of all the elephant migrations in Africa, from the Makadi Pans to the Okavango Delta. There's 120,000 elephants that make this migration across the country, and I wanted to learn more about elephants from my own perspective, and also to see all about how humans and wildlife interact, you know, particularly now where there's huge pressures on resources in Africa, on water, more and more roads and infrastructure is being built which crisscrosses and ultimately destroys these ancestral trails. And I wanted to see what can be done perhaps to protect elephants, but also, you know, not alienate the communities that live there. And traveling on foot, I knew I needed a good guide, and wherever I go I always try and find a local guide who knows a bit about the landscape, can get me out of trouble whenever I need it, and obviously can speak the language. And I found this guy called Kane Motswana from Botswana, and he was a San, a bushman, and he was incredible. You know, he turned up in his full traditional costume, which, you know, is sort of deer skins and his spear and you know, his crocodile teeth necklace. I mean, he really looked the part. And we got some photos. He's right, can I get this stuff off now? And put his normal clothes on. He was great. But he really, I mean, he grew up. We were about the same age. You know, he grew up in the 80s, and he said, when I was a kid, you know, and I was a baby on my mother's back, if my mother wanted meat, she would call out to the lions and ask them for some meat. I was like, okay, what does this mean? She was like, oh, maybe I'll show you one day. So we set off on this walk, and Kane could replicate the noise of any animal in Africa, whether it was a bird or a deer or a lion or whatever, and he could make perfect, which is amazing into itself. But to have a purpose to do this, so if he wanted to see lions, he would make the noise of a distressed deer, and the lions would come. And he did this, and he made this noise, and a pride of sort of 7 or 8 lions just turned up out of nowhere.
What?
And I was like, wow. And he said, okay, well, if we see a kill, I'll show you what I mean. And so another few days passed, and we saw this poor buffalo who'd broke his leg, and he called the lions came and killed this buffalo, and 4 male lions. And he said, okay, we're going to go up to them now. You ready to see this? I said, okay, this is terrifying. So we sort of stalked up to the kill, and we were no more than 10 feet away at this stage. And we'd gone sort of upwind or downwind, whichever, so that they couldn't sniff us. And then he said, right, I'm going to speak to the lions now. He said, just stay there. I said, okay, I'm not going anywhere. He said, whatever you do not run. And he just stood up, and the lions stood up, and they were face to face. And I've got the most amazing photograph from our camera crew, which was, 200 yards away, because they were not getting any closer, on a long lens, of Connie just stood up and a lion right there. And he sort of did this prayer. Every morning he made a prayer to his ancestors to protect us from wildlife. And he looked at this lion, said a prayer, and do you know what the lion did? It grunted and then just backed off, along with all the other lions. They went and sat under the shade of a tree, 40 feet away, and we went right up to this dead buffalo. And Connie got his knife out and said, right, we can have some meat now. And I was mind blown.
No
we filmed
way.
the whole thing. It's all on camera. It's on TV. It's on Discovery Channel. You can see it.
Wow, that's incredible.
It was mind blowing. And that sense of like, I'd never, I mean, of all the places I've been, I've always tried to become attuned to the landscape, but that was probably the most mind blowing of all. But wherever you go, I think there's experiences like that to be had if you just sort of look for them and try and be in the moment and be with people who are conscious about the environment. Then you can find those amazing experiences all over the world.
You can. Share a little bit for those listening, because I know you most recently talked about this notion of the art of exploration. And for those who are, I always think about sort of timeliness, and without going into the politics of the pandemic, just to say, I think one of the interesting things is what we have been shown is that one person's breath on one side of the world can impact literally the lives of every single other person. And so therefore I think the fallacy of individuality is sort of revealed. But also secondarily, I think a lot of people, including myself, obviously, where you've been in quarantine or in sort of forced isolation, which is also, by the way, our greatest sort of corporal punishment, right, is solitary confinement, is we recognize both, I think, the value of community, but also I think people yearning for this notion of exploration, and yearning for the opportunity to get back out into the world. As someone who spends their life as a modern day explorer, what are some of the tenets that you share in terms of sort of the mindset or even practical tips and tools that you share around how one can approach their next exploration?
So for me, writing this book was really my lockdown project. I was stuck in London, all my trips have been cancelled, and I thought, okay, what better way to, for my own benefit really, to sort of look back and really appreciate the journeys that I've been fortunate enough to go on, but share some of the most valuable lessons with other people. So I kind of distilled all of my journeys, not just the sort of ones I'd written books about previously, and the ones that I'd made for TV, but also some of my early backpacking journeys, like when I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also some of my journeys when I was in the military as well, and figure out what were the guiding principles that I took away, and that's that. It's everything from the importance of curiosity in the first place, which sounds like a given, but it's not just about being curious about, okay, and let's go over there for the sake of it. It's like really delving into your own mindset. What drives you as an individual? What drives us as communities? And tapping into those guidelines and really following them to their conclusions. And how you then use that to dictate where you go, who you go with. Surrounding yourself but with a good crew, a good teammate. Like what defines a successful team? I talk about the art of leadership and what it means to be a leader, both on and off the battlefield, but also as part of a team when you're off exploring. And I work with teams if we're on a scientific journey to go and document a certain place, or if we're making a TV show, whatever it might be. There's still that element of teamwork, and you've got to you've got to practice what you preach, and a lot of that is simply leading by example, living by those values and standards that you set yourself and profess to live by. You have to actually be that person day in, day out. It's about integrity. There's a thread of courage, and I don't mean that in any way to say, oh, look how brave I am by climbing mountains. It's really the courage of integrity. It's by sticking to those principles and not wavering. So it's for me, it's been a real act of self-scrutiny in many ways, and pulling myself apart and actually, what do I stand for? What are my morals? where does my moral compass point? And what are the things that I would like to be, hopefully remembered by, for and by. So that's what, for me, the art of exploration has been about. It's been about, it's not to tell people how to live their own lives or how to necessarily go on a journey. It's really some of the principles that I've learned, not just from my own journeys, but people that I've met. And so, I was fortunate enough to interview the Dalai Lama and ask him about what has driven him and how he's kept his community intact. Some other explorers, from not just from history but modern day explorers. You might have heard of Nims Purja, who's the guy, 14 Peaks. I mean,
fascinating Netflix film if you haven't seen it. Yeah, it's incredible.
Absolutely amazing. I met him through the military. He left, and I was actually fortunate to go and join him before he summited Annapurna, his first peak. I flew to base camp to send him off on his merry way, and so. I asked him what drove him, and so I've tried to distill all of these people, really inspirational people, get the lessons that they've learned and put them all in one place. So it's been a really fun exercise, but really hard work as well to try and just. It's what do you exclude, what do you put in? Because there's so much, but to try and really keep it concise, that was the hard bit.
What were some of the greatest insights you garnered in that process? Like, how did you determine? And I'm curious and for those listening, by the way, I mean, he just literally, I think the man who had previously summoned
it was 6 years or something?
It took a year, it might have even been more. And he did it in unprecedented
6
time.
months.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And did it entirely with the team of Nepalese, which was, I think, also a testament to the I think, historical oversights, shall we say, of the way that these explorers are often overlooked, and he broke a paradigm, and not just broke it, he shattered it. But as you look at these different sort of explorers, and I would say, Dalai Lama is also, in my mind, a profound explorer, and also to stay. I was actually honored to host him for his 80th birthday.
Wow! Okay.
And it was incredible. But just noticing the way that he moved through space.
Yes.
It was literally he stopped at this tree. I don't share this very often, but it was one of the things I noticed the most. Right, it was actually less the words and more the way of being, but just stopping to appreciate literally a leaf of a palm tree. Like he sat with it for a moment, and then the way that he acknowledged everyone that came across his path with like a lighthearted, humorous openness.
Yes.
It was like. I was like, wow, just that level of
just appreciation,
and jokingness. Desmond Tutu, that level of, I think, of childlike wonder.
Completely.
I feel like
that was my experience of meeting him as well. Was he just had his whole audience in tears of laughter. He was just cracking jokes the whole time. It was amazing. But yeah, you're right. I think that sense of appreciation, of being in the moment, gratitude, is at the heart of his very essence, and I think that's what he professes. It's compassion. It goes with all of Buddhist, philosophy. Is that removal of attachment to any negativity, and just really seeing yourself from another perspective and seeing things for what they are, and taking the ego out of it. And I think that really is at the essence of the art of exploration, is being humble enough to just try and see things for what they are and not put yourself at the center of it all, and that's really the biggest learning I think anyone can hopefully achieve. Really?
I mean, I think well said, and it evokes for me actually. We were talking about that. It evoked for me actually Siddhartha, and actually talking about Buddhism, but like, thinking about this prince who had, who was, in the gilded home of the royal palace, and then forsook it all and like left everything behind. Talk about an exploration, right? Like that's the spirit, and that led obviously to the path, which ultimately became sort of an enlightened path. But I that notion of surrendering and letting go, that's one of the things I've been, as I reflected. We're recording this now just after the new year in 2022, and I just did a temescal, for those listening and that don't know, a native traditional sweat lodge ceremony here, and I actually have connection to a beautiful temescalero. If you're
I'd love to. Yeah, I did one for my birthday about 5 years ago here, actually. Yeah, it's brutal, but
this one was hot, and I mean, like I've done a few. Yeah, this one was it was strong, you know. But so powerful, and one of those things that you have to confront with is that notion of letting go.
Totally. Yeah.
But also, and I think the temescal was one of the. I did this kind of without getting out there. This temescal was a very, in my view, sort of masculine kind of warrior ethos. Like you had to really confront the heat to the point where you don't know if you can do it. Like people are literally asking to leave, and you're like, no, I'm going to stick it through. But then the grace that comes after valiant effort, right? After actually confronting those.
No, I think that's really at the heart of any journey of, and any exploration, is that overcoming a challenge. And I think that whether it's temescal or whether you do sananga or kamba or any of these amazing plant medicines, that you have to go through the tough bit to really gain the benefits. And that's been part of my journey for the last few years, and it's been remarkable, and it's opened my mind so much to what there is left to explore, because on the face of it, it's what is there to explore? But it turns out there's so many universes out there, isn't there? And that's the beauty, I think, is both the internal and the external journey is equally important.
Yeah, and the two are totally commensurate. As you think about the journeys ahead, and I don't know how much time you spend planning or dreaming about the journeys ahead, are there places, I'm sure there are many, but is there an inner or outer exploration that is calling to you deeply?
So many. I mean, all my trips got cancelled the last 18 months, so I've got a backlog now.
Yeah.
But I was saying to you earlier, like I was supposed to be going off on a journey to India right now, but it's COVID sort of put paid to that. But I've just been faced with a gap now of a few months. But I found that really exciting. It's been a very long time since I've had the opportunity to just freestyle it, and just and I guess going back to a bit of a cliche, but going back to my roots of being a bit of a wandering backpacker, I'm really excited to be able to go and turn left or right or straight at the middle, I don't know, and so that's where I am right now. I mean, I've still got some big expeditions that obviously require some planning that I would love to do. I've not spent a great deal of time in South America, actually, so I'd love to do a big journey throughout all of South America. Papua New Guinea's high on the list. There's lots of places, lots and lots of places that I would love to go and do. But the more, particularly, I'm very fortunate to have this platform of not just writing but TV, and I think it's a case of not just going to places necessarily for the sake of it. It's finding a cause that I feel passionate about, and using these journeys as a way of bringing attention to a particular cause, whether that's conservation or habitat loss or the destruction of the Amazon, whatever it might be, and hopefully doing something useful with it. So that's one I'm just trying to figure out what really is my next project that I want to work on.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I haven't shared this with you, but my background is actually starting a philanthropic music festival, which is all about trying to bring attention to various causes, principally around the issues affecting the extreme poor. Conservation, obviously, as you know, you just did a massive trek with elephants, you had mentioned, through Botswana, and obviously economics have a huge role to play in terms of how people live with the land and animals, etc. But South America, to sort of bring it to, is where I intend to head next, and I feel like calls me so deeply. I feel like one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. Have you been to Patagonia yet?
Yes, but very briefly. I was on the Corcovado National Park in Chile.
Yes.
Yeah. But I was there for a week. That was it. I need to go back and see more.
I've got one of the best spots I've ever been to in my life that I'll share with you. But I won't go into the full story. But I wound up in Torres del Paine. And I love horses for a variety of reasons. But I wound up getting to ride with 2 gauchos to release 50 horses to pasture in basically in the high Andes. And they left me with the horses at sunset. And I kind of got down and it was just kind of quiet. And it was, and I'm sure you've given all the walks you've been on, all the places you've been, you've experienced this, but it was so rare for me, having grown up in a city, to experience total silence. Like the absence of any sound.
Yeah, wow.
And to have the sunset over the Andes and be surrounded by 50 horses with not a person for miles, it was like one of the most
really special.
It was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. So, if I would love to get some recommendations from you, but I would definitely love to reciprocate. I also wanted to just tap on one thing you just mentioned there, where you said this notion of having, obviously you've got this, these incredible TV shows, books. But as you said, right now you're meant to be filming a TV show in India. But instead of being remiss about what didn't happen, what I love, because we were talking about this off camera, and I just want to acknowledge you for it. And I feel like it's one of the things for those listening that is I think the greatest one of the greatest aspects I think of exploration in life. Is that notion of being willing to pivot, right? And like you said, and actually go left, right? Like you could be in the woes, and many people I think get caught in the woes of I'm supposed to be here now, and get stuck in that mental rut, right? As opposed to what you're embracing, we're in Mexico and you're I'm stoked. I'm gonna go. I don't even know where I'm gonna go tomorrow. And that idea, I actually write about in my book about this. It's called basically turning left, which is. You go to, I would go to Yosemite and everyone's in the valley and it's blocked and it's but actually if you go to Tuolumne Meadows, just to the left, there's no one there, or you go to Zion and you're in the Narrows, actually there's no one there. And it's sometimes when it doesn't work out or when it's too crowded, that notion of just going to the left, I think
totally,
is so powerful.
I found that, it's taken a long time to get used to accepting that, but I think when you do, it makes life a hell of a lot easier.
It does, doesn't it?
Because every cloud does have a silver lining. I've really taught myself to hone in on whatever tiny glimmer of positivity there is, even in the worst disaster. In every, the last time I was actually here was in August, I think it was, and a hurricane came through. Tulum, it tore the place up, the hotel got smashed up, and if that wasn't bad enough, the next day, just as the people were coming in to clean it, somebody came and stole my laptop, all my stuff, my camera and everything. It was just oh my god, this is disastrous. But it's you could look at that as a total disaster, but actually the fact that I was then liberated from my laptop meant that I suddenly had a load of free time and I ended up doing loads of cool stuff as a result. It's just you just got to focus on the positives, and every time that something dreadful has happened, there's in every single time, whether it's splitting up with a girlfriend, whether it's having your stuff stolen, whether it's total disaster, there is always something that will come good. And you've got to trust the process, you've got to trust the universe that something will be delivered that will be even better than what you had before. And if you can do that, then you can keep a smile on your face through anything.
Yeah, man. Well said. Well, where can people find you? I know obviously you've got the television shows, you've got the books. Where's the best place for people that want to connect to find?
Probably just on Instagram. Levison.wood, or I'm on Twitter, or my website, levisonwood.com. All my books are on there, and my photography and everything else. So.
Yeah, I've been watching your Leica shots around the world. I was I really resonate with the way that you're kind of bringing this, in my view, this sort of ancient art or beautiful art of exploration, and still holding it in a good spirit and in a good way as you travel the world today.
Thank you.
I really, I acknowledge you for putting that out in the world with your television work, with your books, but also, just it's a pleasure to meet you, man.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to chat and here we are.
Yeah,
What an
man.
amazing place. Thank you so much, Michael.
To be continued, my friend. Cheers.
Let's catch up in South America.
Let's do it. I'm in.
Awesome.
Yeah, we're